Hi, and welcome to Jewish Culture in Sweden online. My name is Johanna Frändén. I am a Swedish journalist living in Paris and focusing mainly on sports, culture, and politics. And I will be interviewing French-Israeli sociology professor Eva Illouz, who holds the chair of excellence at the École des Hautes Études Sciences Sociales in Paris, and whose theories about love and relationships in late capitalism has captured readers across the world, well beyond the academic sphere. Eva Illouz's latest book, The End of Love, in Swedish, Därför tar kärleken slut, will be published by Daidalos förlag in spring. Hello and welcome, and hello Eva, how are you?
Hello, Joanna. It's very good to see you again.
Yeah, you too. We met last year at the Gothenburg Book Fair. It was also an interview or a discussion, let's say, organized by Jewish Culture in Sweden. So much has happened since then. Obviously, your new book, but let's start at the absolute urgent actuality, the Corona crisis, because I know that you've also written a piece that was published in Haaretz newspaper and also in French media about the coronavirus. The title was "Coronavirus Reveals What Really Makes the World Go Round," and it's not money. So what is it?
Actually, the piece, I have to say, was published at the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and then it was published also in other places. So I think one of the claims of this piece, which is not in itself very original, many people have been saying it, is that the coronavirus has called the bluff of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has very much eroded budgets for public goods and resources such as health, education, and infrastructure for the last 30 years. And in fact, many countries were stunned to face a level of impreparation that is even today hardly comprehensible, with doctors and paramedics scrambling to have the most minimal kind of equipment. And this was not only caused by the fact that so many medical supply chains they were dependent directly on China, but also was due to the fact that many countries were simply unprepared because the health budgets were severely cut, and therefore there was no more money around to go for a crisis which may happen but did not happen. So really, I think that this crisis has made many people question even more insistently than before the model that was promoted by neoliberalism, in which the state has become really not only an economic actor, and as more and more, and has thought less and less about maintaining and reinforcing public resources, but has also favored economic actors. I mean, think of the fact that Amazon, the giant Amazon, which is owned by one person, Jeff Bezos, in 2017, the net income of Amazon was $3 billion, and in 2018 it was $10 billion. So I mean, this is hardly of net income. This is hardly comprehensible, and this is only because these company and many others like it do not pay taxes. This is the neoliberal state. So that's, I think, one of the things that is being discussed is this political and economic model, and it is going to be very much discussed and contested in the months and perhaps years after the crisis is over.
Mm-hmm. You also write that it's the state that again and again has proven to be the only entity capable of managing such large-scale crisis. We're now talking about the coronavirus. You could also add, I suppose, the climate change urgency and the climate change crisis to this. Do you think, is this a hope, or is this your real prediction, you know, in the years to come, that state will have a bigger presence in our daily life and in our life in general and in economics?
Well, it's certainly a hope, but if you look at the ways in which Trump is bailing out the economy right now, it looks like, I mean, I'm not an economist, and I think it's still too early to know really, but it looks like it's going to have the shape of the 2008 bailout, which means that mostly the big companies benefited from it. And the 2008 bailout did not trickle down in any way to the small people, which is, I think, one of the reasons why populist movements and somebody like Trump emerged on the American scene. It's because that bailout provoked tremendous rage and anger. So it's my hope, but that hope does not seem right now to be confirmed by the fact. I do think, though, that if something is not done to give the impression that the very high level of inequalities that exist today in the world, that it is dealt with by the state, and that trust in the capacity of the state, in the capacity of the state to care for the citizens, if that trust is not restored or built from scratch, then I think there will be a lot of unrest. I mean, that would be, it's not a very difficult prediction to make. I cannot say exactly right now what form that unrest will take, but there will be unrest. So, scholars like Walter Scheidel predicts or says that epidemics or major disasters are an opportunity for large levels of inequality to be leveled down, and that in fact catastrophes may be bad for individual human beings, but they may be good for societies, in that these catastrophes like war or major disasters like a pandemic can restore a level of equality. I'm not sure about this one, I have to say. So this, I think it is going to require from citizens all over the world to demand, in fact, a rewriting of the contract with not only the state, but that the corporations and the private sector rewrites its contract with society. So I think, corporations and big company and the financial sector should certainly pay much more taxes in order to rehabilitate the economy. It must also finance jobs. And the situation we've had so far is a situation where the private sector has enjoyed, in fact, public goods such as the health of the citizen, the education that the state provides to citizens, and the infrastructures that are provided by the state. It has enjoyed all these resources by trying to give back as little as possible. And corporations have become extremely good about trying to evade as much taxes as they can, which means taxes means to redistribute, the money which you have gotten, in fact, in an indirect way through the use of these public resources. I think this model will have to be revised.
Right. Do you think there is also a chance or a risk, perhaps, that the current political tendencies are reinforced by this crisis? But you write, for example, that contrary to some predictions about the resurgence of nationalism and borders, I believe that we have become aware of how distressingly interconnected we are economically and in terms of health. Now, a couple of weeks have passed since you wrote this, and things happen the whole time. I mean, some countries have suspended democracy. We can see what's happened in Hungary, but in other, I mean, clearly at the moment, even Europe is going in different directions. Do you still feel that this is the final consequence when it's all over, so to speak, that we will feel more connected, and that internationally there will be more solidarity, for example, after the coronavirus, because we have no choice?
I think, you know, we can already see that there are all kinds of conflicting tendencies. So one that is obviously at play and at work is that the international arena has become a jungle where every country is struggling to find masks or medical equipment. And the country which offers the highest price gets the masks first. So that, I think, is happening. Also, I think there is, and probably rightly so, great suspiciousness of China for two reasons. One is that China authoritarian government is actually responsible for probably the fact that this crisis has put the world on its knees by withholding very precious information for many weeks, which were extremely precious. And we know now that time is of the essence in this disease. Had we known already in mid-December or end of December, what we came to know only in mid-January or end of January, things would have unraveled probably very differently. So that's the first reason, or the first source, if you want, of solidarity, of possible solidarity, which will be against China. And second, many countries found their medical supply chains deeply dependent on China. That I expect will change and has to change. Otherwise, you know, I think the economy is really too integrated. If you look at a cell phone, I mean, your cell phone is made of parts that are produced in so many different countries. I'm not exactly sure how you would go about now, you know, how countries would go about producing their own cell phone. So I don't think you can disintegrate a highly integrated economy. So you will have these conflicting tendencies. Also, I mean, look at scientific cooperation. We never had such tight world scientific cooperation. I think this has never been seen before. And Chinese scientists shared very early and very quickly what they knew. They shared the genetic sequencing of the virus with the world. And even though there might be a race to find a vaccine first, I think still we see an enormous amount of cooperation that is unprecedented. So I think we are going to see both a new redrawing, maybe new types of barriers being set up and erected, but at the same time, I don't think you'll be able to disentangle economic relations. And I think you will also see a lot of scientific cooperation and other forms of cooperation, such as I said, perhaps building political blocks in front of China.
Let's talk a little bit about the crisis and the impact it will have on people, I mean, mankind, because especially as a sociologist, I imagine this is of interest. You do write beautifully. What compounds the sense of crisis is the fact that the pandemic requires a novel form of solidarity by way of social distancing. It is a solidarity between generations, between the young and the old, between someone who does not know he may be sick and someone who may die from that person who doesn't know. a solidarity between someone who may have lost his job and someone who may lose his life. Now, this social distancing is, I would say, and I don't know if you agree, one of the biggest human experiences or experiments in a lifetime. I mean, it's, in fact, almost every country of the world and every population of the world has to start distancing socially, and it's lots of us have never done it or not used to it. For example, this week there was a big protest in Tel Aviv against the sitting government, or against Benjamin Netanyahu, with social distance respected between the protesters. They were within 2 meters, but less than 1 meter, I think, of one another. Now, I would like to know how you think that the social distancing what might the effects be on our intimate life, on our love life, you know, between friends for the coming years or even generations?
Well, you know, all these questions about what might be a recipe to, you know, make a recipe to say something silly or something that will be proven wrong. So, but I'll try, but my guess is not better than yours, because I have not done real research about this. So again, my guess is as good as yours. First of all, let me say that I think it's really a kind of an inversion of the category of care and ethics we're used to. We're used to think about care and ethics in terms of proximity, in terms of even hugging, you know, of physical proximity. And social distancing and the kind of distance we have to manifest towards even people we love has actually no real precedent. We can hardly think about any ethical discourse in which care is accompanied by distance, because it's really the opposite of the categories we normally use. With regard to the effect of social distancing on intimacy, I don't think there is only one effect. There are, again, probably many. One of them is that, and obviously so, I think casual encounters will not be as casual and as free spirited as they would otherwise be. And that might resemble a bit what happened during the HIV crisis. I mean, when the HIV crisis started, I think there was a complete redefinition of the rituals of casual and even less casual encounters. So I do think there will be a change in that respect. Another change we might think of, I think that will be more significant, is that people will disagree on different levels of precaution, and that will create a lot of tension. People, because as soon as we go back to the world, the virus is still going to be there, and people will behave differently towards the answering the question of how hermetic they are to the world. I think there will be probably tensions of a new kind that we did not know before emerging about the question of how two people who live together, to what exactly they are committed towards each other. And now think also about the third scenario that I can think of is, think about a household where one person is vulnerable, is considered as a high-risk person. What does it exactly entail on the part of the other people, of the other members of the household? That's a question that has never, I think, been raised. Especially, you know, you can think of the case of a doctor who is married to someone who has diabetes. Imagine she's a doctor and her husband has diabetes. She is on the front lines. What exactly should she do? What responsibility does she have?
Mm.
So I think that a whole new set of questions which we never used to ask ourselves before, that have to do with our willingness to change our entire way of living for someone else, our entire way of behaving or interacting with others. I think this is going to be one key question that will arise. So it will be accompanied by the need to formulate a new etiquette, but it will create new set of tensions. That's what I predict.
Interesting. Speaking about your book now, The End of Love, dramatic title, and where you also speak about or write about how intimacy and relationships have changed. We already read this in Why Love Hurts. This is, I don't know if you agree when I call it the sequel, but it's sort of the thematic is a bit the same. Now, the end of love, is it about when love ends in a relationship, or is this your view on the fact that love, as we have perceived it up until now, is in fact doesn't exist anymore? Love isn't perceived the same way anymore.
I think you perceived exactly the ambivalence I wanted to, or ambiguity I wanted to put in the title, because The End of Love is like the end of history. It's a book about a period that is ending, and what is ending is not, of course, the feeling of love. We all know that people still fall in love and are still in love. But what ends is a period in which love was considered or thought to be a kind of transcendental force that had a quasi-religious value. So that's the period that has ended. So we can say that when we speak about love, we speak about something that is qualitatively different from what it had been during the 19th and a good part of the 20th century. And the reason why love has changed is, as I document in the book, has to do with political, economic, and technological forces. So that's one aspect of the book. The second aspect of the book is to look at the reasons why and the ways in which relationships evaporate before they start, really, and the reasons why and ways in which established relationships end, and what people tell, what are the reasons people tell for these relationships ending. But I would say that the challenge the book tries to meet is to show that the first is deeply connected to the second. That is, the major forces, collective forces, which have led to the dwindling of one idea of love as this transcendental force. These forces, this process is very much deeply connected to the private experiences of private individuals who have experienced the end of love or the impossibility of love. That's the main, in fact, purpose of the book, is to show how these two things meet and explain each other.
Right. You speak about the ontological uncertainty of love. It's the fact that people maybe 100 years ago would feel very safe once they got married, safe in the sense that they would not be, nobody would leave them. They were an entity, they were in a marriage, and that was the way things were, although maybe on the inside you would feel obviously different things. Now, the ontological uncertainty of love, if I understand you correctly, is the fact that all those one-night stands or the undefined relationships, that did sound like a good thing because it was somehow quite tightly, well, it was a part of the female sexual liberation, I suppose. It has also now created, it has really snapped back at women, something that looked and sounded and felt, I imagine, for lots of women, like the perfect, the end of all taboos. How has it now become such a burden for lots of women? How would you explain that?
So I just want to clarify that the sexual revolution was almost necessary because the women were highly controlled through their sexuality, and patriarchal cultures, that's exactly what they do. I mean, they control women through sexuality, for example, by putting a premium on virginity and defining a non-virgin woman as a woman whose value has very much diminished. So the sexual liberation was morally, politically necessary. Having said that, patriarchy is still very much with us and very powerful. And when women liberated themselves sexually, it did not really create, I would say, equality in the realm of relationships and sexuality, but in fact enabled men to dominate women in a new way, which is sexually and emotionally. And so this book and my previous book on the topic, which is called Why Love Hurts, documented the ways in which men dominate women emotionally. That's one of the topics that really interest me. And this emotional domination basically occurs when men can define the terms of the interaction much more than women can. When men can exploit, and this is what has happened, the sexuality of women for economic purposes, for example, in the media industries, which are owned almost exclusively by men. When the sexuality of women is exposed in the pornography industry, which is owned by men and consumed by men to a great extent. So you have on one hand this movement of liberation of sexuality of women, but given that freedom happens within given structures, and that these structures are still patriarchal, liberation quite often ends up doing something else that it did not plan. So that's why freedom without equality is often very problematic. And we go back, if you want, to the issue we raised at the beginning of neoliberalism. If you let people do whatever they want without caring or worrying about equality, what happens is often is that the strongest will simply dominate even more than it does at the beginning. So sexual liberation ended up, and this is what I also try to explain in the book, ended up creating mechanisms of of emotional domination.
And so this is because you also argue that the online dating culture, for example, is both a product of the capitalist consumerist system, but also a means of controlling or dominating emotionally women by men. Has this been accentuated with the Tinder and dating sites and matching sites, or is it just a new way of exploiting this dominance?
No, I mean, many women are quite happy to use these apps, but I would say that in general, the problem of women, or the female, if you want, is that it suffers from devaluation in culture. Women in general are devalued, and they are quite often devalued through their sexuality and their body. And here I very much connect with Catherine McKinnon, which had the first, I mean, or one of the first 30, 40 years ago, already really put on the table this idea that it is through sexuality that women are dominated by men, and through their body and their sexuality. So just think about what is patriarchy. Patriarchy consists roughly in defining women in two possible ways. One is inside the family as a mother, who therefore as the bearer of a vagina, whose aim is to create, exactly, to create life. And another way is, and the second way is to think of women as having a vagina whose aim is to provide sexual pleasure to a man. These are roughly the two main positions in which women have been put. Women always run the risk of being devalued through their sexuality. It's one of the most striking facts about women's social existence.
Okay.
So I think that the internet dating sites, like pornography, sometimes will play in the desire to live sexuality in a free way, and has done that, and sometimes will only reinforce already the tendencies to devaluation through the body that exists already in society.
In your previous book, Why Love Hurts, you compared different sorts of courtship between the 18th century up until now, and how it has changed. And it clearly has changed the way of getting together, premarital sex and lots of things. And divorce, of course, has come into the equation since then. Now, it seems that although the behavior around love and around getting together, starting a family perhaps, and one person living the other has changed, the pain of being left, or the pain when love really hurts, still seems to be the same in every culture, in every era of that we know about in times. I mean, the suffering from love, that doesn't seem to go away, although all the other behavior, our way of behaving changes. Why is that?
I don't agree with you. I don't think the pain doesn't change. I think that if you look at the poetry of the 12th century of knights to women, to the ladies they worshipped and they could not, with whom they could not consummate their relationship with, the pain they describe is a pain that increases their valor, their sense of masculinity, the sense that they are heroic. Whereas I think there is a form of pain that is much more connected to vulnerability, to the vulnerability of the self to another. I think, for example, today, being in pain, also it depends what kind of pain, but being in pain is much more likely to be quickly psychologized and pathologized. Mm. Certainly if it is a long-standing pain of love, you are supposed to be positive and get out of it. Also, I think that the pain people felt when they were supposed to find one single love that defined their lives I think that pain is different from the pain we may feel when we are supposed to, in fact, go through several breakups in order to acquire experience and maturity. It's a very different ways of looking at the romantic arena. So I'm not sure, I would say the pain hasn't changed at all. Sometimes the words we use are the same words, but they cover very different emotional, cultural, and psychological realities.
Right.
I mean, think just of Werther, who commits suicide, and his suicide is a sign for a whole new generation, for a whole generation that this is the way to have sentiments. And the novel of Goethe provoked a wave of suicides. And he provoked a wave of suicides because that kind of pain was viewed in a way as
honorable, perhaps,
as a manifestation of a great self. I don't think today we would view it this way at all. I think we would pathologize suicide out of love. We would view it as a sign of psychological disturbance or mental instability.
Right, but if I am correctly informed, it's still a lot more common for men to commit suicide after a divorce, for example, than women. So even though we talk about it differently, or it's not written about in this heroic sort of sense, are the tendencies still there, or is that because, or are there other reasons behind men and tough breakups, if I may call it so?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. Are there other reasons?
Yeah, or is this like a masculine eternal tendency, because men seem to have a harder time dealing with a breakup or being abandoned, at least from Goethe and to our days?
I don't know. I mean, in the opera or in novels, women die probably more often than men.
Yeah, they always die.
So I don't know if, men probably die more. They commit more suicide overall.
Exactly.
Whether they commit suicide overall more because of love, I don't know the numbers. I just know they commit suicide more. And so I don't think we know to really say that they commit suicide more because of love. I don't think so. In fact, my hunch would be that they commit suicide more often because of financial distress. That's probably, I mean, suicide is quite often located at the bottom rungs of society. So,
yes, let's end this lovely discussion by a question concerning and connecting a little bit to what we were talking about in the beginning. Now, there has been a great deal of success for conservative movements around the Western world, also in Eastern Europe, of course, in the last couple of years, or maybe in the last 5 years. Traditional values, families, women's reproduction, has been put under pressure, or has drawn a lot of interest, at least, and you can see a political movement in lots of even progressive countries, and it seems to be very connected to the nationalist movement. Now, I was wondering whether you think that in this more conservative or traditional idea of the family, and the fact that it attracts voters and people today, could this also be a reaction to this ontological uncertainty of love, because it would be going back to very defined roles and very sort of less modern and confusing ideas of love?
I don't think it's the only thing, but I think it probably plays a huge role. I think uncertainty is, I think we're not equipped really to deal with prolonged uncertainty. And uncertainty in love, as we have come to experience it, touches on what is probably the most crucial aspect of social existence, which is the family and sexuality, from which we derive not only a greater economic stability, also a greater sense of certainty vis-a-vis who we are, a greater sense of self-esteem, and competence as a human being. So all of these are very much have become more uncertain because forming relationships, forming stable, intimate relationships has become more elusive, has become more uncertain. And I try to develop this notion of uncertainty in the book. So it would not be, of course, I think the response to that has been a wholesale opposition to the movement of freedom, which entailed uncertainty. I think the response has been, well, if freedom entails uncertainty, therefore freedom must not be good. And I think that what I would like to promote, the idea I would like to promote, is on the one hand to acknowledge the discomfort which many, especially women, but not only women, men and women, feel in the realm of intimacy and love. And that has been most explicit in religious groups, such as Jewish, ultra-Orthodox, Muslim, or Catholics, who have, many young people have been experiencing a return to religion, among other reasons, because of the difficulty to pair up and create stable structures. So I want to acknowledge the discomfort that is the reason for this adoption of conservative and religious ideologies. But I think it's the wrong response in a way, because freedom has always posed a problem and a challenge. And it is true that freedom entails a much greater uncertainty. So I think the idea for me is to recreate or reopen the discussion on what exactly we owe to each other, what would be a secular ethics of freedom, and the kinds of obligations and responsibilities it entails in the realm of sexuality and relationships.
That is so interesting, and time flies. Thank you so much, Eva.
Thank you, Joanna.
Speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Jewish Culture in Sweden Online. For information about coming programs, please check out the website or YouTube. I am Johanna Frandén, and I wish you all a good day despite the turbulent times. Take care.